Welcome back to lecture number 87. The historical topic is 8.4, the economy after 1945. The themes are work exchange and technology and migration and settlement. Two themes means that there are two learning objectives, and the first learning objective is explain the causes of the economic growth in the years after World War II. The College Board gives several different reasons in this key concepts. It says a burgeoning private sector, federal spending, the baby boom, and technological developments helped spur economic growth. The next 3 slides will cover all of these and then attempt to come up with reasons why each might be considered the most important. The burgeoning private sector refers to the strength of growth of the private companies. In this period, private companies sold products and therefore made greater profit. In turn, they hired more people. This creates an upward cycle that is uninterrupted by foreign competition. After World War II, any country that would have been a competitor in manufacturing in Europe was heavily scarred by the war and was in the process of rebuilding. Another reason for why the private sector was burgeoning was the government passed legislation that weakened the powers of unions. The Taft-Hartley Act, or Labor Management Relations Act, was passed in 1947 and banned the closed shop practice or the requirement to join a union in order to get a job in a certain industry. Through the act, states are also allowed to pass right-to-work laws that limit the power of unions even further. This helped the private sector because now producers can increase their profits, sometimes at the expense of workers. Stronger unions can more often collectively bargain for higher wages for their workers, and if unions are weak, private companies save on their wage cost and ultimately increase their profits. The chart on the bottom right shows union membership as a percentage of all workers in the United States, and since the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, there has been a trend downwards. There are fewer workers in proportion to the entire labor force that are union members. The other chart shows the total number of workers in a union and compares it to income inequality over time. The blue line shows the percentage of income received by the top 1%, and the red line shows the growth and the decline of unions. It shows a correlation that any time union membership goes up, the percentage of income received by the top 1% goes down. Inversely, when union membership goes down, the percentage of income received by the top 1% goes up. The private sector also benefits from government programs that create higher demand from consumers. They're specifically covered in the next slide, but they have the impact of putting money in people's pockets. When disposable income increases, consumers are more able to buy the products that manufacturers sell. This slide covers the federal spending that helped increase demand in the economy. The biggest one is the GI Bill. It was signed by Franklin Roosevelt in 1944 before World War II ended. It was meant to help all returning veterans re-enter the economy and civil society. Most of them were young men and had to leave whatever they were doing at home and go fight the war. The GI Bill was an attempt to spread out their re-entry into the labor market. If all service members came back and started looking for jobs at once, it would put a lot of strain in the economy. There would be many that couldn't find jobs, which would make unemployment go up and make people fear that the economy was weaker than it was. Each returning soldier was thus given 1 year of unemployment benefits. Additionally, it gave them access to low-interest mortgage loans, which helped the economy by aiding the construction industry and helped many of them build intergenerational wealth by building up equity in a home. The GI Bill also gives access to college tuition, so veterans could delay their entry into the job market for longer and potentially get a higher paying job at the end of it. There are some deficiencies in the implementation of the GI Bill that negatively impacted veterans of color. In southern states, the GI Bill had to comply with the Jim Crow system, so white veterans had a disproportionate access to the benefits of the GI Bill than black veterans. President Eisenhower expanded Social Security by increasing benefits to keep up with inflation and introduced disability insurance for workers. It gave more money to retired people over the age of 65 who were on Social Security and thus allowed them to buy more goods. Eisenhower also passed the 1956 Federal Highway Act. The act gave funds for the construction of interstate highways that better connected cities across the country. It helped the construction industry as there were now new projects to build, but it also helped increase economic activity by speeding up commerce and the shipment of goods within the U.S. This is comparable to the effect that the Transcontinental Railroad had on the country, or the invention of the steamboat, or the construction of canals in the early 19th century. With newer, bigger highways, the automobile industry and all other related industries like gasoline and rubber also grow. For people who lived in the cities, the highway gave them an option to move to the suburbs and be part of that demographic shift. The New Frontier programs of JFK and the Great Society programs of LBJ also put more money in people's pockets. Some of their programs included tax cuts on the middle class. That leaves more money in people's pockets and increases consumer spending. LBJ's Medicaid program provides healthcare for those living in poverty, So now they have a chance to escape poverty if expensive medical bills were keeping them from rising in socioeconomic class. By the time that the 1970s come around, the economic situation will look a lot different. The oil-producing exporting countries, or OPEC, placed an oil embargo on the US for their support of Israel in Middle Eastern conflicts. It triggered an economic slowdown. However, since there was an oil shortage, the price of gasoline went up and it triggered widespread inflation. This phenomenon is called stagflation. It's when the economy stops growing or is stagnant, and at the same time there is inflation. This is problematic because the way to solve inflation can make the unemployment rate go up, and the way to lower unemployment may make inflation worse. So the government had to choose which problem it was going to tackle first. They end up trying to tackle inflation first, which drives up unemployment. The 1970s were not such a great time economically for the US, also because the other manufacturing countries that had been hurt by the World War, like Germany and Japan, were now serious international competitors for US manufacturers. The baby boom refers to the period between 1945 and 1970 when about 50 million people were born. This generation was brought up on mass consumption. That means that it was a present part of their entire life. Mass consumption had started earlier in the century in the 1920s, but was severely interrupted by the Great Depression. The generation that came of age after World War II came of age in a period of sustained prosperity and mass production. Their spending habits reflected that. The baby boom generation was also more accustomed to women working outside the home, so if there's more workers in the labor force, that means that the economy can also be more productive. Technological developments generated economic prosperity because they led to new consumer goods which increased the standard of living in most American homes. Some of these were small appliances that saved time on daily tasks like the dishwasher and vacuum cleaners. Others, like the television, encouraged consumers to keep up their spending habits with the ads they were exposed to in their living rooms. In Nixon's kitchen debate with Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, Richard Nixon, as vice president of the US, was trying to show people in the Soviet Union that the average American had washers and dryers, refrigerators, and stoves in their homes, which made life a lot easier. These consumer goods drive economic growth because people were getting conditions to get the newest and the best appliance, even if they already had an older version. There's also new technologies that are being bought by the US government from private companies for larger projects. A new space industry is developed with the space race and Kennedy's promise to reach the moon by the end of the 1960s. NASA, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, would buy components for their rockets and spaceships from private manufacturers. It made certain communities dependent on the government spending on these new technologies. The defense industry followed a similar model. Companies like Lockheed Corporation made airplanes during World War II, and they continued to build new weapons and airplanes that the US commissioned in the buildup of arms during the Cold War. The second learning objective for this lecture is explain the causes and effects of the migrations of various groups of Americans after 1945. The key concept for this objective says, as higher education opportunities and new technologies rapidly expanded, increasing social mobility encouraged migration of the middle class to the suburbs and of many Americans to the south and west. The Sun Belt region emerged as a significant political and economic force. One of the biggest reasons for the expansions of higher education opportunities was through the GI Bill. It gave about 7 million returning veterans post-secondary training. About 5 million of those went to a traditional four-year college. 2 million of these veterans took advantage of some other type of vocational training. The downfall of the GI was that black veterans were less likely to enjoy all the benefits that were due to them. Not all black veterans had the same access to education as white veterans. College tuition may have been covered, but because of discrimination and segregation in higher education, black veterans were not able to go to all of the same colleges that the white veterans could. They more often went to historically black colleges and universities that could not always provide the same level of education or job prospects. Since there were fewer colleges they could choose from, black colleges oftentimes had to serve more students than they could handle. The growth of the suburbs was a result of the first planned community, Levittown. William Levitt was a developer that designed these suburbs with rows of houses in subdivisions. The houses were cookie-cutter in that they were generally pretty similar in layout and facade to one another. That was by design as a cost-saving measure. Levittowns, or any community designed by William Levitt, did not allow homes to be sold to African American families. Again, this gave an unequal chance to build wealth for white American families than black Americans. Mortgage loans for home purchases were insured by the government by the FHA, or Federal Housing Administration. However, the federal government wouldn't insure loans in areas they deemed risky, which happens to be in areas that were predominantly inhabited by blacks or minorities. The areas in which they would insure mortgages were usually areas in which only white people were able to buy homes through the practice of restrictive covenants. This practice was called redlining, after the way that areas where the FHA would not insure mortgages were outlined in red ink. Finally, the growth of the Sun Belt was the second demographic pattern of the period. This is the south and the west of the United States. In this region, there are warmer climates, lower taxes, and employment and defense industries that attracted people from other parts of the United States. As more people moved into these states, their population grew, and every 10 years, based on the census count, reapportionment awards representatives and ultimately electoral college votes to the states with bigger populations. These states then start factoring more and more into presidential elections. Richard Nixon in 1968 makes a play at the entire South of the United States that had historically voted for the Democratic Party. By the 1972 election, southern and southwestern states start a pattern of voting for Republican candidates. Finally, here is the recap. The United States economy continued to grow through the post-war period, primarily due to the government spending and the growing private sector. These are two really important reasons as to why the economy grew. Stagflation in the 1970s were the first signs of an economic slowdown in the United States, and finally the economic growth was paralleled with the growth of the suburbs and the Sun Belt.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.